So now I want to come to Asia, in particular the countries of Japan, where you're based, and South Korea. Japan and South Korea have been very loyal allies to the US, but now with Trump kind of ripping apart these alliances, and also China gaining military strength, how do you think these countries are hedging their bets? Economically, the US is down the throats of Japan and South Korea, and militarily, China is slowly gaining prowess in Asia. And with US so much invested in Europe and the Middle East, so what do you think will be the decision making process in these countries?
It's a very, it's again a very good but a very difficult question and a broad one. We could talk about it for quite a while. Let me maybe just lay out that I don't know that much about the Korean situation. Um, I know more about the perceptions here in Japan.
Sure.
But let me maybe say that one of the biggest differences between Japan and Korea, when it comes to the way that the United States engages with them, is that for Japan, there is no military um, the military alliance structure with the US looks different for Japan than what it looks for Korea. In Korea, we actually have a military binding treaty that that combines US forces and Korean forces. And if the North Koreans should ever attack, then those combined US Korean forces will be under the supreme command of a US general. So if things go very very south, the US will be in charge also of the military power of the South Koreans. That is not the case for Japan. For Japan, the security treaty that they have looks different. It's also different from NATO. um, the deal that was struck in the 50s and then again in 1960 is a very simple one. It is land for protection. The Japanese agreed that the US can station its troops in all over Japan, including Tokyo, Yokosuka, including Okinawa, and have military bases. In return, the US promises that it will protect Japan if any part of the Japanese islands of the archipelago is attacked, then the US is obliged, by treaty, obliged to fire back and liberate that part with the Japanese self-defense forces. So Japan, until this day, a military force, but it doesn't call it an army or a navy because the old one, army and navy, they were destroyed after the Second World War. They were dismantled. They were completely, cut out from the political process and dissolved. And then they created new new military forces, the maritime self-defense forces, the ground self-defense forces, and the air self-defense forces. And those have a mandate to only operate within Japan and only be responsible for the security of Japan. That's why Japan has been participating only very scarcely in foreign deployment. Although they had a couple of soldiers in foreign countries, I think, including Iraq, they always work in very under very very tight constraints, including they're not allowed to shoot at any potential target unless the target shoots at them first, which then leads to the situation in which US and European troops need to protect the Japanese self-defense forces because they cannot engage in battle before they're not shot at. And even if one of their friends is shot at, the Japanese troops cannot engage because as long as they're not shot at. So the Japanese have a very, very constrained military force, although it's a relatively big one. I mean, on the military firepower index, Japan has a relatively strong military force, but they constrain them politically very, very strongly. And the United States, you must also know, the Japan is under no obligation to reciprocate. If a U.S. ship next to a Japanese, if a U.S. military ship next to a Japanese military ship here next to in Okinawa is attacked, the Japanese ship is not allowed to help because they are not attacked. And that is something that now the United States complains about very much, but that is something the US itself wanted to implement back in the days when they were still scared of Japanese rearming, of the Japanese rearming and remilitarizing. But this is just an outcome of this long history. Now, Japan, for the longest time, the last 50, 60 years, built its entire security strategy around that security alliance treaty with the US, knowing that as long as this deal holds, they are under the US security umbrella, including the nuclear umbrella. which is why Japan is not that worried having no nuclear weapons themselves, although, little asterisk, they do maintain all of the knowledge and the capability to produce their own nuclear weapons, and it is an open secret in the security community in Japan that if Japan ever decided politically that it needs a nuclear weapon, it could have one within about 6 months, because it has the whole technology, it has its own domestic nuclear program for peaceful use, and it could use all of that in order to create nuclear weapons, including the delivery vehicles and so on. Which is why Japan is usually counted as a nuclear threshold state. Now, with all of this said, the strategy has been to um, to 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 rely on the fact that the security treaty is in effect, and that the United States is maybe not the easiest of all partners, but at least in the security sphere, military sphere, a reliable one. That understanding has changed. Trump 1 kind of shook the Japanese and kind of made them unsure about if the United States is still going to be a reliable partner. And now Trump 2 drives the point home. So the many colleagues that I hear that I talk to, they are aware that something needs to change, and Japan needs to change its security approach, because even if there are some people who would still want to stick to the old agreements, you cannot be sure that Trump or the next president will not just like flip it up and just walk away. Hence, Japan is now slowly shifting toward trying to produce more weaponry domestically, and increase its military spending, while at the same time they're not going the same route as the Europeans. They are not promising a 5% spending target and so on. They doubled from 1 to 2%, which for Japan is already quite large. And some people in the West hailed that as Japan now taking over more responsibility and being more of a proactive, more of an offensive force. But there are two schools of thoughts in Japan itself. One is the one that supports this and says, yeah, Japan needs to integrate into the US strategy more thoroughly and be usable. And the other one says, like, no, we just need to prepare for the moment when the US will finally withdraw and we're going to be on our own. But what they then converge basically on the understanding that Japan must have certain military capacities themselves, and they cannot rely on the US. So this understanding that the US is not anymore a reliable partner is now one of the guiding thoughts in Japan, that then leads military strategists to create future scenarios of how they want to approach problems. The good side of this is that the Japanese also have like no appetite whatsoever for a war with China or a war with Russia. And they are much more careful in their dealings with both of these countries. The Japanese, for instance, they never completely abandoned the oil drilling projects in the north, where they had a joint project with Russians. They never completely ended.
Sakhalin, right?
Sakhalin, exactly. Around the Sakhalin Islands, they are the oil drilling projects, and they never completely withdrew from that, although they put it on hold for a moment. But that's now continuing. And with the Chinese, they develop. First of all, they have very close economic connections. Of course, I mean, China is the most or second most important trading partner for Japan, without doubt. And the people are going back and forth all the time. They have very good economic and tourist relations, splendid, in fact. One where a lot of Chinese come to Japan to visit and to do business. And they also are establishing the political relations are not too great, but they're also not too bad. And they're establishing military to military, or at least defense to defense ministry ties. They have a hotline since 2 years ago where like one minister of defense can pick up the phone and then talk to the other one directly, in order to make sure that if ever anything happens with a boat accident or something, or with airplanes, that they can like de-escalate on the highest level if necessary. And all of these are confidence building measures, and they also have like working level top or sub-top working level meetings of the ministries of defense, and they have continuous exchange. That is a very good thing. So Japan, I would say, is overall pursuing a policy, a foreign policy of stability as far as possible, while also not losing the United States, because the integration with them has also been huge. For the Koreans, I would need to find you a better expert who can tell you how the security apparatus there perceives the United States today. But the fact that they are even more deeply integrated militarily must change the picture for them.
So my final question for you would be: is the U.S. Slowly losing influence in Asia because neutral countries, like, at least you would say, non-aligned countries like India, have come to experience in the recent weeks, would reveal that all countries must hedge their bets very carefully. So, like you said, if such close treaty-bound allies like Japan and South Korea are becoming wary of the U.S., how would you say the overall, you know, influence looks for the U.S. in Asia?
The influence, it depends on each country. International relations is inherently a bilateral affair, although we sometimes lose sight of that. But you always need to analyze what are the country to country relationships, and with some of them are very tight, like with the Philippines. The United States has a very, very strong foothold now in the Philippines. Um, the With Mr. Marcos is partially also due to the fact that the Chinese were not willing to come to an understanding with the Philippines on the South China Sea issue, and now the Philippines threw its lot in with the Americans, and I think that is I do think that's a mistake, because the US will use this as a stepping stone. And what happened with Ukraine in Europe could happen with the Philippines in Southeast Asia. I pray to God that that will not happen, but a possibility. It could happen with Taiwan, but with Taiwan, it would work differently, of course, because the political dynamic would work differently. China has no claims on the mainland Filipino archipelago. There are overlapping claims of certain little islets and features, but not on the archipelago. When it comes to Taiwan, this is of course a very old problem and a very old unresolved civil war. And China says this is of course part of us. Taiwan says um, we are China, but you are the CC, the Chinese Communist Party. You currently occupying our seat in Beijing, but the official rhetoric from Taiwan is now we want to be an independent country. I mean, of some parts of the political process, but anyhow, it's with Taiwan it's very complicated. With the Philippines, would look more classical in the way that a proxy war could be fought. Um, Overall, I see that, of course, what happened with India is loosening the grip of the United States. But just keep in mind that whenever the US is about to lose political influence in one of in the countries that it considers its sphere of interference, it will work on staging some sort of regime change. That's what happened in Pakistan. Imran Khan didn't want to be anti-American. He just wanted to be a neutral. He actually said so. And I'm not sure he said so, but I'm sure that the United States, the Undersecretary of State, actually said we cannot accept an aggressive neutrality like the one from Imran Khan. And sure enough, a couple of weeks he was gone. It happens in Bangladesh, it happens in Sri Lanka, these regime change operations, and funnily enough, the new heads that come to power are always more US friendly and more US aligned and more willing to take loans from the IMF and World Bank and from foreign creditors than the previous government. So any government that works for more strategic autonomy is naturally being undermined, and any government that pushes for closer ties, and not just ties, but dependencies on US and US led institutions are then being supported and installed. And India might run that danger too. I mean, we cannot predict that, because usually when this happens, when these crowds of students come out on the street and then the regime change starts, it often happens quite unexpectedly. But retrospectively, we're then able to say, like, okay, this is how it started, and this is where the influence began, and this is where the money then flew in. We know that for Ukraine now because people have researched it. But when it happens usually quite as a surprise. And then that the United States is extremely good at this, extremely, extremely skilled at using a wide network of NGOs and media centers and whatnot in order to not control but strategically influence political perception and political preferences and create, and be the kingmaker within several parties. I don't know how far this goes in India, but India would be very well advised to make sure that that can happen and have some laws on the books, for instance, about foreign funding of local NGOs, the way that the Georgians implemented it, in order to make sure that it is Georgians that remain in charge of Georgia, and not the the National Endowment for Democracy. Uh, or the USAID, although that's now part of the past. But you get what I want to hint at. Overall, I think, of course, in Asia, the US influence goes down. China down. ASEAN is more careful. India is careful. And there's a lot of states who now understand, even though they don't want to make enemies with the United States, they want to maintain friendships. You need to keep an arm's distance. A lot of countries understand that. And Indonesia, Malaysia, ASEAN in general, India understood it well, and that understanding is now translating into policies, and also multilateral policies around the BRICS and around the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. So overall, this structural influence is waning.
Well, Professor Pascal, that was a very broad ranging conversation covering a lot of topics. I liked how you gave a very, although it was a long explanation, but it'll definitely make it more easy for the viewers to understand these topics, because sometimes brief explanations won't, enable them to understand the context. So I thank you for your time, and I look forward to hosting you again when your time permits. So thank you so much.
Thank you for your interest, and see you next time.